You're coming with me. What kind of pain leaves a woman arriving covered in bruises, carrying not just wounds on her skin, but scars on her soul? How many times must she be silenced, traded, or cast aside before someone finally sees her worth? And yet, could this moment, these few words from a lonely rancher, become the doorway to a life she never dared imagine? The train screeched as it slowed into Dust Hollow, station metal grinding against metal, as if the wheels themselves protested what was to come. Clara stepped down from the carriage with her head held higher than her aching body wanted it to be. The hem of her travel dress brushed against the dust, and the plain shawl, pulled tightly around her shoulders, hid what she could of the darkened marks on her arms. What it couldn't hide, the swelling near her eye, the purple bloom along her cheekbone she carried with the dignity of someone who refused to bow. She was 50 years old, no stranger to loss or cruelty. Her family had sent her west as a mail-order bride, not out of love, but to be rid of her. The bruises were not from travel alone. They were tokens of what she had survived before the train had even whistled. Whispers followed her steps the way tumbleweeds follow the wind. A few townsfolk glanced, then turned away. Pity was rarer than gold out here, and often worth less. Clara adjusted her grip on the worn leather valise. Inside were only a change of clothes, a comb, and a letter she had once read until the words grew faint. That letter, so full of promises, had brought her across the miles. Yet at the station, no one stood waiting with her name on their lips. Only the dry air, the long shadows and silence, heavy enough to bruise a heart already tender. Then from the edge of the platform, a voice cut through. Quiet, gravelly, but steady. You're coming with me. She turned. A tall man, Thomas, stood with his hat in his hand. His face was carved by years under the sun, his eyes the color of weathered earth, calm but not unfeeling. He didn't stare at her bruises. He didn't look past her either. He just looked straight and level, as though meeting her was not a burden, not a judgment, but a simple fact. Clara's lips parted, but no words came. She had been commanded all her life by fathers, brothers, men with tempers, and men with money. But this wasn't command. There was no leash in his voice, no bargain in his tone. It was invitation wrapped in certainty. You can refuse, Thomas added softer now, as if he sensed her hesitation. But it's better to make choices in a place where the air is warm, not out here on a cold platform. Her chest ached with something unfamiliar. Mercy, maybe, or the start of trust. She nodded once, just enough to let her weary feet follow his. The wagon that waited outside was plain, painted the fading blue of a sky just before nightfall. A cushion patched with calico lay on the seat. She lowered herself onto it, surprised at the small kindness. Small kindnesses mattered most when you carried bruises. They rode in silence, but not the cruel silence she had known before. This one felt like a quilt drawn up on a cool evening, protective waiting. The road curved toward a homestead that wasn't grand, but spoke of care, fences mended with patience, a porch with room for 3 chairs, a barn roof straight as a hymn. When he handed her down from the wagon, Thomas did not grasp her arm. He let her steady herself and simply stood nearby in case she faltered. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and soap. He set a kettle on the stove, then nodded toward a basin with fresh water. Take your time, he said. Her hands shook as she unpinned her shawl. In the mirror above the basin, her reflection startled her, silver in her hair, purple at her jaw, eyes still alive. She pressed the cloth to her cheek, wincing at the sting, then lowered it to her ribs where yellow-green shadows spread. She did not cry. Not yet. Thomas set a plate beside her elbow, cornbread still warm. Eat first, he murmured. Decisions can wait. Clara stared at the bread. No one had ever told her that before, that her choices could wait, that she wasn't demanded to answer, obey, or bend. The steam curled upward like a prayer she hadn't dared to speak. She took a bite. Salt, butter, and the faintest sweetness melted on her tongue. For the first time in years, food did not taste like survival. It tasted like care. That night, in a small room off the kitchen beneath a quilt pieced in stars, she lay awake listening to the coyotes. Their cries sounded like grief carried across the desert, but also like belonging, one voice answered by another. Her last thought before sleep, he said, "You're coming with me." Did he mean for one night or for something longer? Is Thomas's invitation only a moment's mercy or the doorway to a life Clara never believed she deserved? The morning sun over Thomas's ranch rose gently, painting the prairie in shades of amber and pale gold. Clara stirred awake beneath the quilt of stars, her body stiff with the memory of travel and bruises, but her spirit caught between fear and something softer. She hadn't meant to fall asleep in a stranger's home, hadn't meant to trust the quiet of his voice. Yet here she was, still breathing, still safe. She rose slowly, folding the quilt as if it belonged to her to care for. Old habits died hard. Work was the only way she had ever justified her existence in someone else's house. When she stepped into the kitchen, Thomas was already there, sleeves rolled, hands roughened by years of labor. He didn't look surprised to see her. He simply nodded, like her presence was something ordinary, something he had expected. "Coffee's hot," he said, gesturing toward the stove. The smell filled her chest before the warmth filled her hands. She hadn't been offered coffee first in years. Usually it was the men who drank, while she served her own cup, left cold if remembered at all. She sipped, and the bitterness steadied her heart. Thomas sat across the table, quiet. He wasn't a man who filled silence with noise, and Clara found herself grateful. Silence had always been her prison. Yet here in his company, silence was different, less a punishment, more a space where she could hear herself breathe. After a while he said, "You don't have to explain. Not unless you want to." Her fingers tightened around the mug. He had seen her bruises, of course. He had seen the way she winced when she lifted her arm, the way her steps faltered if she turned too quickly. Yet he didn't ask who had done it, didn't ask if she had deserved it. For the first time, no one demanded she confess her shame. "I've been told all my life that my story wasn't worth hearing," Clara said quietly, her voice rough from years of silence. Thomas's eyes lifted to hers. "Then maybe it's time someone listened." The words pressed against the wall she had built. She swallowed hard, unable to speak more. Instead, she turned toward the window. Beyond it, the land stretched, wide fences holding back cattle, the barn roof catching the morning light, and two hawks wheeling together in the pale sky. Freedom had a look, and it was something like this. By mid-morning, Clara found herself wiping down the kitchen counters, her hands moving without thought. Thomas had gone to the barn, but when he returned, he didn't scold her for touching what wasn't hers. Instead, he set a basket of fresh eggs on the table. "Thought you might want these," he said simply. Her lips parted, not for thanks, but for wonder. He hadn't brought her jewels or trinkets, only eggs still warm from the hens, like an offering of ordinary life. When she cracked one into the pan and the yolk bloomed golden, something broke inside her chest. She realized she wasn't cooking from obligation, nor to keep from being struck. She was cooking because she wanted to, because the smell of frying eggs meant a table where she might sit without fear. As they ate, Thomas asked, "Do you plan to stay?" The question wasn't demand, it was possibility. Clara set down her fork. "I don't know yet, but this is the first place I haven't wanted to run from." Thomas didn't smile wide or boast. He just nodded once, a quiet relief passing over his face. That was enough. That night, as Clara washed the dishes, she caught sight of herself in the lantern glow. The bruises were still there, but in her reflection, they looked smaller somehow, as if dignity itself could dull their edges. In a house where silence no longer punished her, Clara felt the first stirrings of belonging. But was Thomas's steadiness enough to keep the ghosts of her past at bay? The following days at Thomas's ranch were stitched together with small, steady rhythms. Chores done without harsh words, meals shared without fear, silences held without judgment. For Clara, it was disorienting. After decades of being scolded for doing too little or too much, she almost didn't know how to live in a place where every step wasn't measured by someone else's temper. Still, the bruises were reminders. Every time she lifted a pail, the ache down her ribs whispered the voices of men who had called her worthless. Every time she caught her reflection in the wash basin, she saw not only her lined face but the shame she had been told to carry. Thomas never pressed her to speak, but the questions lingered in her chest like stones. Could she ever be more than what others had carved her to be? Did she even deserve peace? One evening after supper, Thomas lingered by the hearth. Clara was mending one of his shirts, the fabric thin at the elbows. He studied her hands for a long moment before asking quietly, "Does it hurt?" She looked up, startled. "Your ribs," he clarified. His eyes were steady, not prying. Clara hesitated. Then softly she answered, not as much as the words did. The silence after that was heavy, but not cruel. Thomas only nodded like he understood that some wounds live deeper than flesh. Then he said almost to himself, a body can heal with time, but a heart, well, that takes someone willing to see it. Clara's hands stilled. No one had ever spoken to her that way, not as though she was a burden to be pitied, but as someone still worthy of tending. But shadows are not so easily banished. That very night, Clara dreamed of her family, the ones who had sent her west like cargo, insisting she would be better off as someone else's wife. In the dream, she stood again on the auction block, Bruises' fresh eyes downcast, while voices bartered her life for pennies. She woke with a cry caught in her throat quilt twisted around her legs. When dawn came, she stepped outside to breathe the cold air. Thomas was already saddling a horse. He glanced at her, reading the tremor in her frame, but said nothing. Instead, he handed her the reins of the gentler mare. Ride with me, he said. The ride was quiet, the prairie unfolding like a hymn, long grass bowing the horizon endless. At one point, Thomas slowed. His horse turned toward her and said, I don't know what's behind you, Clara, and I won't ask until you're ready. But whatever it is, it doesn't have to decide what's ahead. His words lingered in her like an ember refusing to die out. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine, what if she wasn't just surviving? What if she could belong not as a servant, not as a traded woman, but as herself? Clara felt the stirrings of a life she had never dared imagine. Yet the ghosts of her past still clung tightly. Could she truly step into a future unshackled from shame? The weeks rolled forward, marked not by calendars but by the rhythm of ranch life, feeding stock, mending fences, cooking meals with what little they had. For Clara, each small act was a thread, slowly weaving her back into the fabric of the living. She found comfort in the way the land spoke softly, wind sighing through sagebrush, the creek's low murmur coyotes yipping far off in the night. Yet beneath the fragile peace, her heart still carried the weight of unspoken battles. At times, Clara caught herself waiting for a harsh word, waiting for a door slammed, waiting for the sting of rejection. Old habits are stubborn. Pain can make its home inside a person so long it feels like truth. It was Thomas who gently began to break those walls. One evening, he came in from the fields with a basket of apples, rough and misshapen, but sweet to the taste. He placed one in Clara's hand and said simply, for you. No man had ever offered her anything without expecting something in return. She almost didn't know what to do. Why she asked the word escaping before she could stop it. Because you've been working hard, Thomas replied, his voice even quiet, and because kindness ought to be answered. That night, Clara ate the apples, slowly letting the juice linger, as though it were a promise she was learning to trust. But not all promises come easy. The town was small and news spread quickly. When Clara ventured into the mercantile, whispers trailed her steps. That's the woman, someone muttered. The one who came battered and bruised. Another voice, sharper, added, Rancher must have taken pity. Don't see why else he'd keep her. Clara's cheeks burned. The old shame pressed in loud and familiar. She almost left without her flour and sugar, but when she reached the door, she saw Thomas waiting outside, steady as a mountain. He didn't ask what was said. He only took the sack from her hands and carried it himself. Later by the fire, Clara finally spoke. They'll never see me as anything more than less. Thomas looked at her a long while. Then he said, firm but tender, then let them be blind. I see you, and I reckon that's enough. His words struck deep, like water seeping into parched soil. For the first time in decades, Clara felt the faint stir of worth rising inside her, not borrowed, not traded, but her own. Clara had begun to glimpse a life where dignity could replace shame, but the world outside their walls wasn't ready to let her heal so easily. Would the weight of judgment crush her hope or strengthen her resolve? Winter crept down from the mountains, laying its white hand across the valley. The ranch, though humble, felt almost like a haven. Clara had found a rhythm with Thomas. She cooked, tended the chickens, even stitched warm linings into his old work coats. He never asked, but he never failed to notice. One evening after supper, Clara caught Thomas watching her as she set the plates aside. His eyes were steady, softer than she'd ever seen. But before she could speak, a sharp knock rattled the door. Thomas opened it. A man stood there, shoulders stooped, hat pulled, low breath, clouding in the cold. Clara's heart stumbled. She knew that stance. That voice. Clara, he said as though her name still belonged to him. It was her estranged brother, the one who had bargained her into a forced marriage years ago, the one who told her she was a burden, that the family's debts outweighed her dignity. His presence was like a shadow long buried but never gone. "I heard you were here," he muttered, eyes narrowing toward Thomas. "Didn't think you'd land on your feet after all that." Clara stiffened. Old fear rose in her chest, but Thomas stepped closer, his presence quiet but firm. "She's not alone here," he said. Her brother scoffed. "I didn't come to fight. Just wanted to remind her of what she left behind. She wasn't worth much then, and she won't be worth much now." The words hit like stones, but this time Clara didn't bow her head. She lifted her chin, her voice trembling but clear. "You're wrong," she said. "I was worth more than you ever saw, and I am worth more still." The man blinked, surprised, but said nothing more. He left into the snow, muttering, boots crunching against the frozen earth. Inside, Thomas looked at her, waiting. She braced for pity, for apology, for something sharp, but he only said, "You spoke true. Don't let him take that from you again." Clara's hands shook as she leaned against the table, but inside, a weight she had carried for years began to shift. For the first time, she had faced the past, not with silence, but with her own voice. Clara had spoken against the ghost that haunted her for decades, but the wound left behind still pulsed raw. Could her newfound courage truly free her heart, or would the scars of betrayal cut too deep? The days after her brother's visit were heavy with silence. Clara still rose before dawn, stirring the fire and baking bread, but her hands trembled more than they had before. When Thomas spoke kindly, she answered, but her voice carried a brittle edge. At night, lying beneath the quilt, she stared at the rafters and wondered if she had made a mistake staying. What if her brother was right? What if this was only borrowed warmth destined to be taken from her? One morning, Clara packed her shawl and a small bundle of clothes. She left the kitchen table set for Thomas and stepped out into the frost. Her boots crunched the path toward the road. Each step was heavy, like walking with stones tied to her ankles. But before she reached the gate, a voice called after her. "Clara!" She turned. Thomas stood there. Coat unbuttoned, hair still damp from washing, eyes filled not with anger, but with something deeper, something almost like fear. "Don't go," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. Clara swallowed hard. "I don't want to bring shame on you. The town talks, Thomas. My past, it follows me." He stepped closer, his breath visible in the cold air. "Let them talk. What I know is this: you've brought more life into this ranch in months than I've known in years. You think you're a burden, Clara, but you're the reason this place feels like home again." Her eyes filled hot against the winter wind. "I don't know if I know how to stay," she whispered. Thomas reached for her hand, rough and steady. "Then let me show you. We don't have to rush. Just don't leave me to face these days alone." Something broke open in her chest, then, not like a wound, but like a door. The road behind her felt cold and endless, but his hand, warm and real, was something she had never dared to hope for. Clara lowered her bundle and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Clara had turned back from the edge of leaving her hand held by a man who saw her worth. But could she truly let herself believe in love after a lifetime of pain and silence? Spring came quietly, the way healing often does, not with trumpets, but with the steady drip of snowmelt, the greening of pastures, the sound of calves bawling in the distance. Clara had stayed. Each day she found herself less a visitor, more a part of the land, of the work of the silence Thomas carried like an old friend. Yet the town did not forget. At church one Sunday, whispers followed her into the wooden pews. "Mail order bride. Bruises. Not worth the trouble." Clara kept her chin high, but the words stung like nettles. When the service ended, she hurried toward the wagon, heart pounding. But Thomas was waiting outside. He stepped up beside her, his voice carrying steady over the murmurs. "You'll speak kindly of her or not at all. She's under my care now and my respect." The crowd fell silent. Clara's breath caught. No one had ever stood for her like that. That evening, the ranch was lit only by lantern glow. Thomas had built a small table bouquet from wild sage and prairie flowers, clumsy in arrangement, but tender in its intention. He placed it in front of her as she finished the supper dishes. I'm not a man of fine words, Clara, he said quietly, but I reckon life's too short for half-truths. You belong here not because I need a cook or help with the stock, but because this place and we're better with you in it. Will you stay not just as a helper, but as my wife Clara's hands stilled on the dishcloth? For a moment she heard every cruel word from her past echoing, but then they faded, replaced by the steady truth in his eyes. She nodded, tears trembling free. Yes, Thomas, I'll stay. It wasn't shouted, wasn't grand, but it was the truest yes she had ever spoken. After a lifetime of silence, Clara's whispered, yes was louder than any applause. But how will this late-found love grow under the watchful eyes of a town that once scorned her? Sometimes life gives us no gentle path, only bruises, silence, and nights too long to count. Yet even then there are voices that rise above the pain. A simple phrase like "you're coming with me" can feel like a hand reaching into the dark, pulling us toward a place of safety, dignity, and maybe even love. For the mail-order bride who arrived bearing scars no one chose to see, it was not beauty, wealth, or youth that defined her. It was her quiet strength. It was her willingness to keep walking, to keep showing up, to keep believing that tenderness might still be waiting beyond sorrow. And for the lonely rancher who chose her not as a possession, but as a partner, healing began too. Together they remind us that redemption is possible even when the world has long forgotten your worth. Friends, perhaps you too have known moments where life felt heavy, where you wondered if anyone would say, you matter. Stay. Let this story be a gentle reminder. Scars can become stories, and stories can become bridges toward love. If this tale touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, to share this story with someone who might need hope, and to leave us a comment below. Tell us, would you like to see what happens next in their journey, or hear another story of quiet strength and late-found love? We read every word because your stories matter too.